Hi everyone. So I am Heba Abd El Gawad. I'm an Egyptian Egyptologist who I do specialize in the Egyptian Egyptologist who I do specialize. There is a bit of an echo, but anyway, in the history and archaeology of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, yes, I do have an interest also in how do Egyptians perceive their ancient past and modern, if you can call it reception or modern Egyptian representation of ancient Egypt in the present. I'm very delighted to be here today.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Naunton. I'm an Egyptologist, and I've been a member of the Playing in the Past team from the off, and very happy to be here, and very, very happy to be here with Gemma, of course, and also with Heba, who I've known for a long time, and it's one of the best people there is. So I'm really delighted that she's agreed to join us today, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot. No pressure, Heba, but you know. So just while Gemma sorts out these issues, and by the way, Gemma is the sort of overall project leader, but also tech support and everything else on this, and the technical issues are well beyond my know-how and capabilities, so I'm sure it won't be very long before she sorts this out. In the meantime, just to say what we're going to do today is Heba's going to do a short talk of around about 10 to 15 minutes, I think, just to introduce her work and how that applies to the game. And then we are going to have a look at the game. We're going to wander around in the game, and the idea is that some of the themes and the issues that Heba focuses on in her research and has explained a little bit about in her talk, we're going to explore those within the game. I will be chatting to Heba as we go along, and Gemma will be chipping in where she can. Gemma's at the controls of the game as well, so thoroughly occupied here. But of course, if you've got questions or comments as we go along, do please pop them in the chat. Our Playing in the Past colleague, Dr. Kate Shepherd, is also with us today, just not on screen. She is Kate Shep in the chat. So she's going to be checking for your questions and comments, I think, and she'll be putting those to us one way or another. So we'll be able to take questions as we go along, and hopefully we'll all, well, no doubt, have a very interesting and informative couple of hours ahead of us. So that was me filling in for Gemma on the intro.
Okay, so I decided to flip the question that we had as a title for the I don't want to call it a talk, but for the game we're playing together today. So I thought that instead of who lived in Ptolemaic Egypt, I would like to start it off with how did Ptolemaic Egypt manage to be as multicultural as it was, or as diverse and exercise inclusivity, I think, or I can argue, I would say, in some sort of a very successful way that could be, I can claim or I can argue that it was one of the very first multicultural states in antiquity that was extremely successful in showing a diverse way of ruling, or in showing or in respecting and recognizing the diversity of its population. So we'll start with the fact of how multiculturalism is quite ironically, I would say, and unfortunately, an issue today. And we've seen this in the past few years with the Brexit, as well as with the previous president of the United States, who would have to remain unnamed, and I apologize. But anyway, we've seen a bit of how multiculturalism became, rather than the solution, it became the problem. And the diversity of the nations became problematic with many calls. And I think that this is very interesting, particularly today, for the two events happening in two separate parts of the world. For the case of Palestine, which is not a case of the Muslims being kicked out of the mosque, as much as it is the diverse Christian, as well as Jewish, as well as Muslim community in Palestine fighting for the rights in the land, as well as few of the immigrants currently in the UK being kicked out of their homes by the UK Home Office. So I think this is a very fitting day to have such a game played out today. The identification or the definition that we have for multiculturalism, which is what you can see on the screen, it's very much currently the scientific or the way we perceive it from an intellectual point of view. But in reality, instead of this positive endorsement, it has been turning more and more into a negative endorsement where promises of ending diversity or promises of ending multiculturalism in certain society became the winning card for many elections that we're witnessing today, not only in the West, but equally as well in the Middle East. Looking at Brexit, what was extremely interesting to see is how that the areas that had the highest of immigration were the ones that were equally pro staying in the EU rather than being separated from the EU. And again, this gives us an idea of how having a mixed society or a mixed culture, something that is a positive aspect that leads to a far more global world rather than a very narrow view of the world. There is a problem that we have with history, and I think it's becoming again very clear every single day that we learn nothing from history. Instead of using history to tell us how we should do better at the present, we are still looking back at history we're unlearning history, which is a bit problematic and a bit of a shame. So this would be more of like a 101 guide into what the Ptolemies did concerning multiculturalism that was right and how we are getting it wrong ourselves. I don't know if any of you have been to the British Museum. I guess we've got a very diverse audience here, but a few years ago, the British Museum had an extremely a blockbuster exhibition called Sunken Cities. And it was talking about more or less of Heraklion, one of the harbors that existed in Ptolemaic Egypt, and one of, let's say, the centers of the rulers, which existed that was part of Alexandria itself, which would be the center of the focus of the game today. Looking into the Hellenistic world after Alexander the Great, his legacy became divided between his various army leaders. Each one of them took part of the share, and instead of holding up to Alexander the Great's unified Hellenistic world, it became all divided into separate states. Egypt was the prize for the Ptolemies, starting from Ptolemy I till Ptolemaic XII. What was interesting is how that, despite of how successful the Ptolemies were, looking at them from the Roman perspective, the Romans perceived the Ptolemies as extremely unsuccessful in the Near East, and they are not worthy to be great royal counterparts. The Roman emperors did look very much down at them, although they would have provided the Romans with an excellent lesson in ruling, again, multicultural societies that might have helped the Romans to stay for a bit longer. I don't know if that would have been good or bad, but it could have been helpful for those who were pro the Roman Empire. This is a bit of a timeline of the various Ptolemaic rulers, and as you can see from the diversity, they are a mixture of pharaohs, a mixture of Greek Basilius, Greek rulers, as in the Greek word for ruler, and you would see how they embraced all the Egyptian cultures from before. What was interesting about the Ptolemies is that they expanded, or the extent of Egypt reached its perhaps largest during the reign of the very second ruler. So from the very beginning, they were well aware, or they had some sort of imperial expansion claims. And what was interesting is the first rule that they led. We usually tend to think, or even when we go to any museum today, we would be headed to the ancient Egyptian gallery. And within the ancient Egyptian gallery, Egypt stops at the Greek period. Everything that happened after Alexander the Great stepped in, or perhaps one would say that the Egyptologists stepped out once Alexander the Great stepped into Egypt. So anything that comes from the reign of Alexander the Great onwards that doesn't look Egyptian as we perceive or as we imagine what Egypt have looked like gets to be displayed in the Greek and Roman department. Even objects coming from Thebes, objects coming from Alexandria, objects coming from any of the Egyptian nomes, from the Egyptian territory itself. But they have a bit of what we perceive or what we imagine as a Greek flavor for it would be placed into the Greek and Roman department. This dispersal of Egyptian heritage, even within the museum, led to the perception that we have is there were the Egyptians and there were the Greeks, and there was a very fine line between them, which no one has crossed. But in reality, this was extremely crossed. When we look at any exhibition, we would usually have Cleopatra as the main ruler, and we all remember Elizabeth Taylor, and she was equally part of the problem, where she made everyone focus on the Ptolemaic period from the sense of the myth and Cleopatra, like Cleopatra versus Rome, this romantic fetishized story that takes us away from the contribution that this period have led. You would see, if you ever go to the sculpture gallery in the British Museum, at the very, very end of the sculpture gallery, obviously the Rosetta Stone is in the middle. And although the Rosetta Stone is in itself a signature of how Egypt was a very diverse, very multicultural, and a very tolerant, one can say, society to mixed cultural and to a variety of cultures, the Rosetta Stone is introduced to us only in terms of its contribution to archaeology or into its contribution to Egyptology, while the main story that was behind the making of the stone as well, the treaty that was signed between the priests and the king, which we have many examples of which throughout the whole Ptolemaic period, is totally eclipsed. And we see at the very end of the sculpture gallery a group of Egyptian style, and again, this is because they fit the very Egyptian stereotype or the way we perceive what Egypt is. They get to stay into the sculpture gallery, but they are dismissed at its very end that one can almost totally miss them in a typical visit. Yet we would see two of the most fantastic bronze statues that we have, not only from the Ptolemaic period, but from the whole of the Greek and Roman contribution to art. They are displayed in the Greek and Roman department, like perhaps 200 meters away from the very same stelae, coming from the very, very same time period. They date to exactly the same reign of these two kings and queens. Here we see Ptolemy II and Arsinoe, his wife, as well as two of the iconoi or the jars that would have the Egyptian Greek queens and goddesses displayed on them as part of votive offerings. This is obviously problematic, and things have been changing. What I find was interesting we have the movie Alexander the Great. We get to see at the very end Anthony Hopkins, who I admire and love the most. He's displayed to us as Ptolemy I. But interestingly, he is displayed in something that is absolutely Greek. He looks very Greek in what we again perceive as Greek. And the palace from behind is a mixture of Greco-Egyptian or Egyptian Greco type of interpretation. But in reality, what we get at the very end when he's talking to one of his advisors who looks extremely Egyptian, obviously we would see the Egyptians coming from with a darker color tone. And it was the Egyptian advisor who was wearing a completely pharaonic style, which was a misidentification, because the pharaonic style he came up with was a royal style rather than one that is for like the lower grades of society. I didn't have enough time to have the snapshot of it. It slipped me, so I couldn't do it. But if you want to give the advice that the Ptolemies have given us, it would be something that Queen Elizabeth, I would say, does it very, very well, is soft power, doing it softly in a way that you would have to be a bit having a soft touch in the way you rule, but not only a soft touch in the sense of appealing more to your diverse society in something that we can call a style of emotional governance. So here everyone is fond of Bond, who isn't? And everyone is fond of dogs, and seeing the Queen in such a very civil, non-royal style, mingling with the 07 as well as the dogs, something that would be appealing not only to her diversity or to her multicultural audience at the beginning of the Olympics, which is again a Ptolemaic contribution, more or less the great Olympics that used to be held in Alexandria, which is a Ptolemaic contribution to the ancient and modern world, the Ptolemies did something that is very extremely similar, is putting the carrot and trying to push people to softly believe in everything. Soft power technologies that we see today are diverse, and this is exactly the same thing that the Ptolemies had used. They became very soft in the way they ruled. They used all the media available to them, but they equally made themselves very much seen. So the very first portraits, or the very first having a royal figure minted, or a royal portrait minted on a coin, is something that has been introduced to the world from the Ptolemaic period. But it's a scientific fact that we rarely tend to acknowledge because of how Ptolemaic Egypt, or the Ptolemaic period, is more or less eclipsed between the Roman Empire and the Pharaonic era, although it were the bridge in between that have contributed to much of what we perceived as modern ways of living in a multicultural society. They embraced the very Egyptian style, and they didn't just embrace the Egyptian style of rulership, or the way that a ruler or a pharaoh looks like, but they introduced new contributions as the W race. We usually would see one cobra here, but the type of a W race, a double cobra, something that refers not only to Upper and Lower Egypt, but equally to Greece and Egypt, to the dual nature of the rule. So this was a symbol of inclusivity, and the message that is being sent to their audiences that everything comes in two, everything comes in double, everyone is included and everyone is seen. Again, we see the kings presented in a very pharaonic style, but it is exactly the same king. We would see him represented in a very Greek style. This comes from the main target of soft power is being able to target your audiences, being able to target the message that you want to send out to your audiences. And it has to appeal not only to their culture and their sensibilities, but equally to their emotional and cognitive being. They want to be, or they like to be, rightly seen. They weren't just seen, but they were rightly seen. So this is something that it appeals to me very much, and it dates back to Egypt in 2010. Just to say that media manipulation, I'm not accusing just the West, I'm accusing ourselves as well, that we have a bit of it in how the state tends to manipulate the media. And I don't know if manipulate, maybe it's something that we can discuss together. Here, it's a case of manipulation where, although in reality, Mubarak, our president, being the eldest of all the rulers, was at the very back of the procession, which is something that is in line with the events happening today in Palestine. Again, one of the peace talks that was held in the United States in a similar intifada to the one that we're having today. We could see Mubarak at the very end, but then when it came to be a photo that has to be shared with us, the Egyptian audiences, magically Mubarak came to the very forefront of the red carpet. When the Egyptian audiences complained, because now we have the internet and what we can actually verify every single photograph online, then the head of the journal, the head of the newspaper, gave us the excuse that this was more or less a representative photo. It was not a realistic photo, but a representative photo of the situation. If you were to be coming to visit Egypt from Europe at that time, or at the time of the Ptolemies, the first thing that you would see of Egypt or of Alexandria would be the pharaohs. But not just the pharaohs, but you would see two gigantic statues of Egyptian pharaohs and an Egyptian queen, as well as a deity, the ones that have been on display, or the ones that they were surrounding the palace in Alexandria. So the first thing that you would see of Egypt and its ruler would be a very Egyptian style. This would be your first glimpse of Alexandria. They were two over life size, and they were too colossal that you could see them from a distance. And this would be the first image that you have of Alexandria. Although today we tend to imagine Alexandria as something that is very Western and very Greek, but in reality, the visitor to Alexandria would have seen it something that is truly and extremely and definitely Egyptian. This arrangement, or how this was made to appeal to the outside audience, this was targeted to whoever is coming to visit Egypt from the outside. And I think that the way that the Ptolemies used it was something that was for distinguishing their own rule. We could see here a glimpse of the statues marching, or the procession that they've had in Alexandria after they were discovered under the water, after when the whole of Alexandria drowned in a variety of events, but they were retrieved from under the water, and this was the procession, the modern procession they have in Alexandria. But interestingly, they might have had a similar procession, because there are rumors that whether these statues used to be existed in Thebes and then they were moved to Alexandria, or whether they were made specifically for Alexandria. Whatever, however, they ended up, the stone that was used in carving the statues, or even in moving the statues from their workshop, wherever the workshop was, which was probably Memphis, to their final residence in Alexandria, that would have been the same procession that they would have along the roads of Alexandria, as we can imagine back in the ancient time. And these are the statues as how they appear to the visitors to Alexandria from a distance. Again, this is them in another exhibition in Japan, just to give you a glimpse of the height, the extreme height. They were also, if anyone is here in France, they were equally displayed in a very interesting exhibition on God Osiris in Paris a few years ago. And you could see them from in the road in Paris, you could see them from a distance, because they were displayed outside the exhibition room. That was the most fantastic display they ever had. The image that you would see in Alexandria of the ruler would have been exactly the same image that you would see in Thebes, the same image that you would see in most of the temples throughout Egypt, where you would see the Ptolemaic Greek, originally Greek, or by time they became Egyptian, because this became the house of the Ptolemaic rulers from Ptolemy I onwards, and many of the future Greek rulers up till Cleopatra. They were born in Egypt, they were fed in Egypt, they lived most of their lives in Egypt itself. So they might have known very little about Greece, except for the visits they've had or their encounter with their Greek members of the court as kings, rather than being Greek themselves. So again, defining those kings as being Greek, I think they were more of Egyptian Greek or Greek Egyptian, but they were evidently the product of the multicultural that existed in Egypt. This multiculture isn't something that came only first during the Ptolemaic period, but it was the existence of the Greeks in the other harbor of Egypt in the north, what we know as Naucratis, and how they've existed in Egypt since the 4th century BC in a variety of settlements, and they equally had their temples, and they were able to exercise their own Greek religious rituals in absolute freedom, even when Egypt was not yet ruled by the Greeks. It was these Greek settlers in Naucratis who actually helped the Egyptians in expelling out the Persians. How or why the Persian left, I don't think that it was a matter of the cultural difference in the rulers being foreign or being Persian, as much as of how they didn't abide to the cultural code of conduct that you would need to follow ruling a multicultural society, which is different than what the Ptolemies do. The Ptolemies were ruling softly, they were seen, but they were equally felt, in the sense that they were trying to appealing to people's emotions, unlike the Persians. So they started introducing a concept of a royal oath, that when you are in court and you are giving an oath that you are saying the truth, it would be an oath by the king's life, and you would call him both the pharaoh and both the Basilius, something that is a mixture of all Greek and Egyptian rule. If you were, there was the laws were very much made to be abiding to the cultural references as well as to the cultural traditions of both the Egyptians and the Greeks. There was no widely sweeping laws that were fitting everyone, except ones that had to do with, let's say, when it comes to marriages, when it comes to the right in worship. These were all very specifically made according to whichever culture or whichever religion that one was following. The only general laws or the only general conceptions were one that has to do with the organization of the society from an administrative and from a legal perspective. But anything that comes to culture, to people's sensitivities and sensibilities, was left to be very local. They were felt something that we had is that they had so much interest in Egypt that Manetho was actually asked by Ptolemy II to write the history of Egypt, to sit with the Egyptian priests and write the history of Egypt. But not only the history of Egypt, but equally the Jewish history. There was, again, a Jewish presence in Egypt before the Ptolemies and during the times of the Ptolemies. And in their way to ensure that there was so much inclusivity and so much diversity in the land, they equally ordered the translation of the Old Testament so that all the members of the society that they were ruling, or the members of the state that they were ruling, would be equally represented and equally seen and felt by the state and by everyone. But they equally had some sort of their own cult. I'm going fast so as not to take much of the time. But they equally had their own cult, that they started a cult of themselves. And they were very clever in using women. And I'm sure that the females with us in the chat, or the females with us here, would be lucky to know that the single, or perhaps that the secret to holding any society together that is multicultural is women. And they understood this very well, and having a female figure that has all the positive identifications of women, in sense of not only motherhood, but equally being sensitive, being emotional, being as an icon of reproduction from a positive point of view, and someone who could be appealing to everyone, and someone that everyone could refer to. Everyone must have had a mother and could refer to a female counterpart. So they started with having a cult of ARCE-MO, who was one of the queens, and she was both the wife and sister of Ptolemy II. And it was a cult that was a mixture of Isis and Aphrodite, again, a way of merging both the Greek and Egyptian cultures together. And you would see her either in a very Egyptian disguise here, or in this statue, or you would see her in a very Egyptian disguise as well in the temples. But even in her temple, which became later the crown of Cleopatra, they introduced a new crown for ARCE-MO II. And it's a crown that, again, we can see from the brilliant remains of the color here in the temple of Dandara, of how that the crown also insisted on the concept of duality, in the concept of double, as we can see from the horns, as you can see from the remains of the crown of Isis, and as we can see from the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, which was usually more of a male kingly crown, but it became a female kingly crown. And they introduced the concept of a female counterpart to the Greek world, which is something that they have borrowed or adopted from the Egyptian society. But women had, perhaps one would say, a far more prominent role during the Ptolemaic rule. And what we would see here in the statue in the middle is the product of the mixture of both culture. We would see a statue in a very Egyptian style, but equally in a very Greek style, in terms of the way that the body itself was carved, and in terms of the dress that the queen is wearing, and how she's represented in the flaring attitude, apart from the step left leg forward. And we would see the protruding nipples here, again, a sign of the Egyptian art. This is what Ptolemaic Egypt was like. It was a mixture of everything, not only a mixture of Egyptian and Greek, but equally earlier Persian rule, a mixture of all the cultures that has passed through Egypt. We see this in the coinage, not only in the statues, where we see very Greek styles, as well as the horns. And we could see that again in the, as we can see the coin of Cleopatra here, she would be represented as a very Greek queen, to appeal to the merchants who would be coming from outside, exchanging for commercial and the economy, who would need something to identify with. And the female queens and the Egyptian, the female queens and the male kings became something that you can equally touch. And that was the very first time in the world, in the ancient world, that the ruler is so close to you that you can appeal to him even by touching a coin that has his portrait. Something that was very, would have been unexpected in earlier pharaonic Egypt, where the pharaoh was always something that is very far off and very far away, and access to him or to her was extremely limited. They managed also to have a very diverse rulership, and even in the areas of Greek or the areas of the West that they managed to create settlements with. And settlement again is a word that we're seeing in the media very much in the past 2 days, but they have adopted a way that it was a dual settlement, that we would have ARCE-MO. ARCE-MO is a representation of what is both Egyptian and Greek, the dual nature of the Ptolemaic period, and retaining the same Greek title of the settlement here, as we see in Arsinoe, Patara, etc., etc. Representations, as we can see, varied, and they were equally, and this would be the one that I would like to close off, is how they were extremely sensitive. And this is a sign that we would see outside of the temple of Memphis. It was an Egyptian temple, and one would say this was the earliest street announcement, or the earliest all caps announcement made by the state outside the temple, written in Greek, saying that by the order of the local ruler, who was Greek at the time, that this is an area that is out of bounds for troops, and this is a priest's property. And this is the key in how a successful multicultural society or a state can rule. And this was obviously written down to ensure that the troops or the soldiers wouldn't interfere into the priest's business, and they wouldn't get into the temple uninvited. And this was also a way of asserting that the temple was the property of the Egyptian priests. So being soft, being seen to both your cultures and being felt by both your cultures, and ensuring that all of the cultures included in your society are felt and seen as well. And you create an icon that the various multicultural societies living in your land can love, and you are sensitive to every single cultural group existing, was the key for how the Ptolemies managed to rule. And to sum it quickly, who actually lived in Ptolemaic Egypt, somewhere that perhaps it's an answer that can come from the diversity adopted currently in emojis, is everyone. Everyone could be living in Ptolemaic Egypt. This can be the merchants coming to do some sort of cultural and commercial exchange, and many of them chose Egypt or Alexandria as their home after time, as well as the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Persians who existed in Egypt from before, the Asiatics who were living in Egypt before the arrival of the Greeks or the Ptolemies. So who lived in Ptolemaic Egypt, I would just sum it as everyone, and thank you very much. Looking forward to the game.
Thanks so much, Heba. That was amazing. We're really so lucky to have somebody who understands the Ptolemaic as well as you do, has such a depth of knowledge. Because you're right. You said right at the very beginning that Egyptologists tend to walk out of the room at the time Alexander the Great arrives, and I think a lot of us, I would count myself in that too. A lot of us don't do that knowingly or willingly. It's just the way the subject has developed. So
exactly.
We find ourselves, somebody like me finds themselves, years and years and years into a career in Egyptology, wondering what all of that Greek Roman stuff is all about. But so it's really great to learn as much as we have done just in that short presentation from you today. The next step for us is to see how well Assassin's Creed does in representing this incredibly interesting phase of Egyptian history, and I guess how well it does in kind of conveying some of the important themes that you have spoken about. Because I think what was something I liked really a great deal about your presentation was how you made it relevant to today. And this is really, as you kind of signaled right at the beginning of your talk, this is in some ways this is the point of history, to learn from what's good and what's been bad in different parts of the world and different places, and some of this stuff is so relevant today. So shall we have a look at how Assassin's Creed does by entering the game? I guess so. Over to Gemma at this point.
Hopefully they might be able to hear me, but they can definitely see the game even if they can't hear me.
Yeah, folks, you wouldn't normally get me blundering my way through a thank you. Gemma is really our resident MC and project leader, but with the possibility of technical issues, I'm afraid you get muggins here.
They can hear me, Chris. They can hear me.
It looks as though they can hear you, Gemma. Great. That means that I can leave. Great.
Don't you dare.
No, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that.
Sorry about that, everybody. I'm clearly not a professional at this, but I try my best. But here we are now in the game. So it might be a little bit slow, I'm afraid, guys, because we're in Alexandria, and it's extremely large and my computer is a little bit slow these days. But I'm going to sort of call my horse and sort of start making my way over towards the city. I loaded us in just outside the city, so you could sort of see a little bit of the landscape outside the city. But I thought that this would be a really good way to enter it. So I'm coming from the side where the hippodrome is outside the city. If I just bring up the map for people to see, you'll be able to see where I am. I am the little blue arrow. And so I'm going to walk across all these fields to the gateway into the city here, to this main street. And then perhaps Heba can sort of talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing in the game and how that relates to what you've just said in your presentation. Because I think that the game, whilst it does do a good job of representing some things, and they have made a lot of effort, I do think that there is still a very distinct difference between what you're saying about it being a society where everyone was there, and in the game where there are sort of blocks of society of different types of people. So I'll just start walking towards it, and then maybe you can have a think about what you want to say about it.
Whoa.
Yeah, you asked me, and I would say, because also I think the streaming is a bit delayed for me a bit.
A little bit, it will be, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So you and Chris we can just have a conversation together rather than me talking over.
And by me.
Yeah.
I think this is meant to be the Rosetta Gate, right? No. Is it? Oh, sorry. This is the Eastern Gate of Alexandria, anyway.
The Eastern Gate, yeah.
Which would be in fact, the Canopic Gate.
The Canopic Gate, yes.
Yeah. And this doesn't survive, right, Heba? So there's a bit of conjecture here about what we're looking at. Is that fair?
Whoa.
Yeah, one would say yes. I love how they still use the pharaonic a colossal statue, which I would assume that again is a good way of showing the cultural mix of what is Ptolemaic Egypt and Alexandria, because rarely or most of the times when we see Alexandria represented in a movie or in the game, I know this is not the right audience to say this to. I'm not a gamer myself, and I did warn Gemma about this. But from what I see, from what people tend to share, it tends to be very Greek. And what was interesting here is showing how that there is this mixture. There are the Sphinx, there is the Pharaoh seated. So I would assume this is, yes, a more or less fair representation, apart from the not very right hieroglyphs and etc. But that's not that should be the least of our worries at this point. This is a good job so far.
Yeah, agreed. I think we've kind of already covered before how the hieroglyphs, whilst a lot of the time they have used actual hieroglyphs, they're decorative.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, we accept that. I suppose you can't expect too much, can you?
Yeah, that's true. No, but it's a good job so far.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna walk down the main street, I think, so everyone can sort of get a look at what the different types of buildings and people and things that are all present here.
It's probably worth saying for anybody who hasn't been in one of the sessions we've run in the past where we visited Alexandria, that Alexandria wasn't the Ptolemaic city of Alexandria, the capital city of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, was not much more than a village named Rakotis until the time of the Ptolemies. So what we're looking at here, we are meant to think is entirely the product of the Ptolemaic period. Is that fair? Do you think, Heba?
Yes, I think so. That's what Alexandria is. It's the product of the first two Ptolemies, if not entirely the second, who have done most of, like, let's say if we're talking about the library, the pharaohs, all of those signatures, if we can call them the Ptolemaic signatures, or the the Alexandrian signatures were introduced during Ptolemy II. So it is, yes, it is a product of the diverse Ptolemaic rulers, I would call them.
So in other words, if we're seeing what look like very Greek things and very Egyptian things, then that's the game designer's attempt to show us what a kind of Alexandria that had been deliberately built with both styles in mind might have looked like.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. True. Very true.
It feels busy here.
Can you say much, Heba? Can you say much about the population of Alexandria at this time?
The population of Alexandria was extremely, I would say, mixed. What we have from the very beginning, or what we know, that this was as in it became more or less the capital of Egypt in the north, and we've had Thebes in the south. But the perception that we usually get thrown to us is that there was far more Greeks living in Alexandria than Egyptians, but it's not true. And even if it's true, I think it has to do more with we need to remember that Egypt in itself, that the majority of the population were farmers. That was what the Egyptians do, that the majority were farmers, and that the minority were the priests and the scribes. This was like, one would say, a fraction, 10% of the whole population. And in a place like Alexandria, this is not to say that there weren't Egyptian intellectuals there. There were. Even the library had Egyptian scribes working there, which is something that we rarely get taught when we're in classics, let's say, or when we know about Alexandria as growing up. We rarely get to know that there were Egyptian scribes and priests and Egyptian scientists, intellectuals working in the library and offering, I would say, not just offering lessons to the Greeks in terms of teaching them hieroglyphs, teaching them some of the Egyptian sciences, etc., etc. So it was a very mixed society. But the majority of the population in Egypt, which were farmers, would have very less to do in Alexandria itself, because it wasn't intended as a place where people would cultivate the land and crop. It was more of a harbor, a place where people would do much more of a commercial exchange. And that one wouldn't say that there weren't Egyptian merchants. There were, but this wasn't the majority of the population. So if the Egyptian population there was less than most of the other cultures, this has not to do with the bias as is usually exported to us, that this was not much of discrimination as much as it was the nature of the Egyptian society, even during the time of when it was entirely ruled by Egyptians before the Ptolemies. So it was a very mixed population. Obviously, there was huge social gaps. One would say there were the quarters. The quarters weren't as type of the ghetto that we experience today. So if there was a Jewish quarter or a Greek quarter, the thing with the past, when we look at it with the modern eye, that we tend to use the negatives about the modern history, expecting that all what we've inherited is like the biases we have today, we just inherited from past societies. But that's not true. They weren't ghettos as what we see today, but they were more of areas where the groups of the same culture, let's say, would live together, because there they would have their places of worship. They could experience their own cultural rituals or cultural enterprises, whatever that would be, religious or not, in certain parts of the city. And it's something that is very understandable. So I wouldn't say that this was segregation as much as it was like a natural, like the natural. This was the nature of things. This is how things have developed, or at least the more and more you would read about the laws during Ptolemaic Egypt, etc., you would get to feel that there wasn't that feeling of segregation, because there were lots of intermarriages between Egyptians and Greeks, and lots of business contracts and commercial exchange and partnerships between Egyptians and Greeks and Egyptians and Jews and a variety of societies. So it was a mixed population, but maybe the Egyptian, the highest of population was more of the Greek, but that again comes from the nature of what the city was meant to serve to the Mediterranean, not necessarily to Egypt. It's not a product of what we call today like a colonial settlement, or at least that's the way I see it.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting just flying over these buildings as we are at the moment. Some of them at least look very much as though we're intended to think that these are mud brick houses, the kind of tower houses that we know were at sites not just in Alexandria but elsewhere. And this is not a Greek import, right? This is this is much more indigenous. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it was fair, although I wouldn't say that the roofs looked a bit like, this looks a bit too Asian, like it's a bit Asian to me.
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't look the way that I would have imagined an Egyptian house from. It would have had much of a flatter roof rather than the pointed one, I would assume. But it is a fair reflection. But we know that Alexandria, because Alexandria was meant to also be the way that the Ptolemies would brag about their luxury, about how the image that they want to send to the rest of the world. So we know that much of the city was also in marble, just as a sign of the richness of the Ptolemaic period, how rich and famous they were, and that was the way they were attracting foreigners, and they were sending a message equally to the rivals of. It's part of the soft power. It's the expression, or making it very visible that this is a luxurious type of state. They've owned so much. So it was made more of marble. Even some of the streets we know were paved with marble as well, but obviously in the royal quarters or in the elitist of quarters.
We are heading towards the royal quarter and the lighthouse here. So I guess we're really moving into the part of Alexandria where the Ptolemies were using their buildings as a way of exhibiting power and wealth.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd fly over here and have a look if there are any Egyptian statues over here, as Heba was talking about before in her presentation.
Yeah.
I think if you go, we can see some obelisks. If you go into the royal palace, which is the one that's immediately kind of to the right, as you enter the harbour, it might be interesting to walk around in there.
Yeah,
maybe.
I can definitely take us there. Yep.
I always think in the game it would be great if you could use the eagle to fly and then just drop down exactly where she is, but you've got to go back, haven't you?
Yeah. Yeah, I have to wait for it to load now.
Damn it.
It's okay, don't worry. It's not normally this slow, to be honest, but it's once again there was an update from Windows this morning, and it doesn't seem to enjoy it when Windows does an update. I think it's probably a driver issue. But we're fine, we're back. I'll make my way over there.
These are where we are now on the screen. These are the more Egyptian mud brick flat topped houses I think we were talking about, although I'm now leaving.
Yeah, they were visible when I was flying over, and we can certainly go back to them later. And we can also look at when we move to Memphis in a little bit, we can look at the different houses that are there, because they're slightly different to the ones that are in this area. Okay, so I'm just making my way over to the palace. Game has crashed. Sorry, the game has crashed for a second. Yeah.
I was I keep thinking of a day I spent with Heba. I'm telling you a story, folks. Now.
Yes, please.
With
there are
Heba
some questions in the chat as well, but do tell the story.
In a place called Minsha. Do you remember, Heba?
Minsha, yes.
About 6 or 7 years ago, and Heba was doing some field work, in this village in Minsha, which is a beautiful village in Middle Egypt, well out of the way. I don't think very many non-Egyptians visit Minsha.
No, or Egyptians even.
Yeah, yeah. It was an amazing experience for me. And Minsha in a couple of thousand years ago was one of the places that is appeared on your one or more of your maps, Heba. It's Ptolemaios Hermiou, right?
Yes. It was the new capital that the Ptolemies made. They made a new capital, something to I wouldn't say to rival Thebes, but something to encourage more and more the duality or diversity, because it would have been difficult to do this in Thebes. So Ptolemy the First created this new southern capital. But interestingly, we know very, very little about it today, apart from the few remaining blocks that you must have seen with us here and there, and even underneath people's houses, some of the royal statues were beginning to appear. But it was and it was meant to be back then like extremely like the rival of Alexandria for a long time. But interestingly, no one is interested much about it or knows much about it. And I have to say, it says again about the bias that modern archaeologists have against the Ptolemaic period, or the perception of we need to study it either from a very Egyptian perspective that is working on the Ptolemaic temples in Philae, Edfu, etc., or from a very Greek perspective that we just focus on the papyri and coinage, because this is what has left, and the very few remains that the Greek remains that we have in Alexandria. But yes, so suddenly or unfortunately, Ptolemaios Hermiou or Menche like totally died out. But we couldn't discover retrieve much apart from what we've had. But we've seen very interesting the remains of the Nilometer, as you've seen with us. And what remains interesting is the diversity that remains in the town up till today. It has a mixture of Muslim and Coptic community coexisting together, as you've seen with us. And many of the houses that are now inhabited by Muslims were previously inhabited by Copts. And you remember when we saw on the balconies the crosses, the very marvelous wooden balconies that were introduced by Coptic architecture then. And it would be like an entirely Muslim family living in a house that has the remain of a Coptic legacy. And we would find, as you saw in the church, a Muslim verse from Ptolemaic Egypt inscribed on the walls of the main church in Menche. And I think it was a great example of coexistence and of how, if it survived, I think it would have perhaps gave us a less biased view of Alexandria or the Ptolemaic period, but sadly it hasn't. So
so it looks like we have arrived. Courtesy of a little bit of a swim. And actually, remember, there were people swimming in Minsha when we were there, actually. Anyway, back to the game. So let's go into... This is I think this is intended to be the Royal Palace, right?
Yeah, it is,
Yeah.
So we have obelisks. We have some very Hellenistic-looking statues. And a very sort of classical-looking entranceway. I mean, it's important to say, isn't it, Heba, this building doesn't survive archaeologically.
Yes, it doesn't. And I think even back in the time, even what we perceive as Greek statues, I don't think, as is becoming clearer more and more today, that they were at the time as white as we see them. Again, it's part of the bias, and we're learning more and more about polychromy and how many of these statues would have been painted, one would assume. And I think they would have had a bit of a more Egyptian twist to it, like the statue of ARCE-MO II, that she, with the step like forward, but she's wearing something that is very Greek. It would have, if it's at the entrance of the palace, it would have been far mixed than the way it is represented today, from what we are getting to discover from the sunken cities, etc.
Yeah, I'm just seeing there's a couple of questions in the stream already. Do you want to take these questions as we go along, Heba, or?
Yes, I don't know where to read the questions. So
that's okay. So I can put.
you can help me with that.
There's one actually which just arose from something you were saying about Mincha. Anubis Beast. It says, is it true that most Egyptians are of Coptic heritage? I guess it means, in the very distant past.
Yes and no, because Egypt has been very, very multicultural, very, very diverse all the time. So even at the time when there was the Arabs invasion, and I think some of the Copts were converted to Islam voluntarily, and there was so much of mixed marriages that one can say that yes, that the Coptics were the origins, but I don't know if perhaps down in my own family, although I'm Muslim, that there was someone who is a Muslim convert who was Coptic and turned into Islam, converted to Islam. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult to pinpoint. And currently the majority is Muslim, but that doesn't make them. Obviously, I don't want people to perceive me as biased, because obviously I could be accused of being biased entirely, given that I'm Muslim myself. But again, it's very difficult, and it's part of the legacy of how we tend to look at identities into a very tick box type of way, that people have to be Muslim or Greek, and that's or Muslim or Coptic, Muslim or Christian or Jews, which is again the current case of Palestine. People see it now as a conflict for the mosque, but they ignore that there are many Palestinian Christians who are living in Gaza today and who are equally facing a problem. So pinpointing who are the real Egyptians, I think it's difficult and it's unproductive. But obviously the Copts, these are the ones who retained the religion. And if it says something, it says that equally there was a bit of tolerance, unlike the image that is usually being sold to us, because they weren't forced to convert to Islam or anything. So that would sum it all. I wouldn't go for yes or no, and I don't know. I don't think anyone has an answer to it, and if they do, they would be biased, I think, because we have no evidence for that.
It reminds me, there's a book, the title of which is whatever, or something like Whatever Happened to the Ancient Egyptians. And it's a bit like the Egyptians were pagan, and they spoke Egyptian and they wrote in hieroglyphs, and then one day they weren't there anymore. What happened to them? They all went. And of course the explanation is we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years of slow, slow process. And we can't really know, can we, what happens in any one individual's mind in a population of thousands and thousands and thousands, if not more. At what point somebody says, I think I am a Christian, actually, or actually I think, I'm really a Muslim, so this is my life now, and we just can't know on an individual level how that works, right, and how people experience that.
I think also there is the problem when and I don't mean again in a biased way, when the West tends to look at other parts of the world that were previously colonized, there is this perception that these societies are only meant to be indigenous if they haven't changed, if nothing happened to them, if they remain very static, and they haven't changed. So while the West has the right to change and to develop and to move from Christianity to other things, or to atheism, or to like secular societies, whatever, other parts of the world, if they change, then it means that they are not indigenous, they are not the local communities anymore. And also what I find really interesting is how that in the past it was very clear that religion was not an identity, it was a practice. And this is something that the Ptolemies have understood really well, and that comes from how they were very keen on translating Egyptian history and the temple texts into Greek, as well as translating the Old Testament into Greek as well. So they understood that this is not this is a practice that is personal and that is individual, and the state itself adopted all the religions that existed in the society, being Ptolemaic. So they adopted the Egyptian rituals and religions, the Greek religions and rituals, as well as the Jewish. So they understood that this is more or less of a practice rather than the cultural identity of one. Of course, it does define the way one makes certain choices, but it shouldn't be the only way that we look or identify a being, a self, or one's identity. And I think while this was made very clear in the past, we are struggling today to see people beyond their religions, and we tend to identify people more with their we tend to see religion as a cultural identity rather than a practice, something that we haven't learned very well from the past, I think.
Yeah, I also think, Chris, in relation to that book about where did the Egyptians go, I also think it's people don't recognize the length of time that's in, for Egyptian history, like how long that time is compared to our history or other history that they know. And so they sort of imagine, like, as Heba's already said this, they imagine like Egypt as a homogeneous thing that was there, and then it was not there, and it wasn't like that at all. And I think it's very easy for people, because sometimes even I, like, when I think about how long the period of time actually was, it's a really long time. And it's easy for you to forget about that, but then when you do think about it, you realize how much history there was there, and like how many people that must have been. How many people must have been a part of that length of history? So I think that's kind of important too, and it's something that's really easily forgotten about.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, agreed.
And also the fact that from the time of Alexander the Great until 1956, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. Like, that's such a long time of like a variety of identities, cultural moving in and out, either rulers or subjects or like visitors or whatever. So it's people tend to ignore this, and I think this is equally key in how, like, obviously things have changed, and obviously things wouldn't have stayed the same. They couldn't, but people tend to ignore this, and I think this diversity that Egypt has, while it's an advantage, but it's equally a curse, that it made Egypt seen as something usually frozen. So we see that there is Egypt in Pharaonic time, Egypt in Coptic time, Egypt in Islamic time, etc., medieval time, and they are not meant to mix. Although the transition is all about mixing things and cultures together. It couldn't be just like a sudden leap from one side to the other. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just noticing something that I haven't seen before in the game, which is one of these tapestries or drapes, I don't know what you call it, which we know would have been present in Pharaonic Egypt, to use that label, which is probably not a very good one. But that's a very kind of pagan Egyptian looking Thoth, isn't it, over there?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is. Sorry, Heba, go on.
No, go ahead, because you would see this very Egyptian style, and on the other side, I think it's something that is very Greek, like a column or something, a state offering. Yeah. And I think it does capture the diversity. There are bits of the game that does capture the duality of what Ptolemaic Alexandria was like. I think like really well, far better than any of the other media that we usually see of Alexandria, better than the movie Alexander the Great, I would say.
Yeah, I brought us over here so we could see a little bit of the kind of statuary, which is sort of mixed, but the architecture over here is not. The architecture is very much Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, we've talked in previous sessions, haven't we, about how the statuary, like, for example, this falcon-headed sphinx, as far as I know, nothing on this scale is attested like that. but it's a kind of, but at the same time, it's a recognizably pagan Egyptian, or it's a mixture of recognizably pagan Egyptian motifs: Sphinx, falcon head with sun disk. But the obvious intention of the designers, I guess, is to, as you say, Gemma, is to mix up these things: Greek architecture, Egyptian iconography.
I was just going to say, if the Egyptians saw this, they would have said, "Oh God, how come we never thought of this?" It does look, it looks well. It defies the purpose of the Sphinx, but it could be another, like, a good combination, Horus and the Sphinx. Yeah, how come they've never thought of
As
that?
a real beast, as an animal, that would be pretty scary. I can't imagine coming across that. Or I wouldn't want to imagine coming across that.
I can't think of a falcon-headed Sphinx at all. Maybe
No,
I'm
me
wrong.
neither. No, that's true. No, there weren't, because the idea is you would have the pharaoh and then the body or the ram and things that can come with 4 legs, like interesting.
I mean, these rams look better, don't they?
Yes. Oh, yeah. This is a true identification representation.
Sorry, I've just gone inside the temple because I saw this enormous statue in here, which I'd never noticed before.
And these are like the ones in Edfu, Chris, no? Like similar to the ones outside the temple in Edfu with the king underneath the Sphinx.
Ah, yeah.
The cult.
I mean,
wow.
this massive statue is super interesting, isn't it? Because, well, I don't know. Heba, what do you think?
Yeah, because it's maybe they wanted to show Serapis. I don't know.
I think so.
Yeah.
Should we explain who Serapis is?
Yes. So it was again one of the. So we said that ARCE-MO was the female goddess introduced to bring both the Egyptians and the Greeks together, and then we have Serapis with Zeus and Osiris mixed as the two gods, into something that is new, into a new god, which is Serapis, and something that both the Greeks and the Egyptians can appeal to. And he tend to look more or less like we would have the god Zeus, and he would have the crown, and he had different representations which were a bit of a mixture of Greek and Egyptian. So the props of him would have been more a bit Egyptian, but he would look a bit more Greek. But that was at the beginning, in order to, when they opened the immigration, or they were encouraging a lot of Greeks to come and settle in Egypt and to become part of Ptolemaic Egypt. So they wanted some sort of an appeal to them in a way, but it's something that can also introduce them to Egypt that is not entirely Greek and is not entirely Egyptian. But I don't think he was very successful in the rest of Egypt, I would say, unlike ARCE-MO. ARCE-MO as a cult, because it was more focused on Isis, and I think that the Egyptian priests were very much far behind it. They supported it and promoted it entirely. She was far more successful than Serapis, because we rarely see him in like the south of Egypt, if ever. Only, let's say, in votive figurines or offerings that would have been had by the Greeks, but he's mainly a northern, or in Alexandria. But even he would have far more cults in the Greek settlements that they were in the Mediterranean, more than he had in Egypt. So that was interesting. It was their way of bringing more Greekness to Egypt, but not to wipe out the Egyptian culture. But as I said, the key for them was targeting their audiences. They wanted to be as inclusive as they want, so they were targeting each audience locally. And I think that they had an excellent PR machine, if I can say that, behind them. And the key was having both Egyptian priests fully behind them, and their court was extremely mixed. There were the Greek members of the court, the nobles, as well as the philosopher and the intellectuals, and there were equally the Egyptian priests and scribes, and they were working very well together, in coming up with something that would hold
It's
the
not the heat that gets
society
you.
together,
Well, it
and
might, if the
bring
miles
in
and
something that
miles
is
of
anew.
endless
And I
barren
think
desert
the
without
Ptolemies
water
were all
don't
about
burst.
regeneration. This is a new period, but we are not totally ignoring the past. We're linking ourselves to the last pharaohs. So it's a mix
I
of
know
old and new.
we've kind of left it now, but I like the rams that
Yes,
are
yes.
sort of surrounding Serapis, as if there's a kind of Ammon connection as well.
The chat actually, Chris, the chat thinks this statue is Zeus.
Zeus, yes.
Yeah, which would make more sense, I suppose, with the ram
Yes.
connection.
How can we tell that?
I don't
It's
know.
Zeus and Amun also.
Public Brick Story says that they imagine that the game devs took inspiration from the Zeus statue in Phidias, by Phidias in Olympia. Which I'm not I don't know a great deal about Greek statuary, so for me, I couldn't tell you whether that's true or not because I've never seen it, but I could certainly look it up.
It could well be right. I mean, I suppose we have to remember us Egyptologists tend to fall back on inscriptions when it comes back to identifying gods. It isn't the case that, for example, if you see a falcon-headed god, that it's always Horus or Ra-Harakti or whoever you might expect. So there aren't those rules.
But he has the horns on his head as well, on the head, because I forgot the Serapis is a mix of Zeus and Amun. I apologize, I said Osiris by mistake. I only recognized now. But he did have the ram horns around his head, like how we would have Alexander on the coinage. So I would assume it was more Serapis than I think it's not entirely Zeus. He wouldn't have been presented with the rams or the horns of the ram around his ears, wouldn't he, Chris?
I guess not. I mean, this is slightly outside my sort of comfort zone, but I mean, like I say, the Egyptologist on me wants to say, if in the absence of an inscription, I would guess in this context in Alexandria, it's more likely to be Serapis. But even if the game designers did take inspiration from a statue of Zeus from elsewhere, I mean, in any case, it's not a genuine object. So,
that's true. He certainly didn't have such impressive six packs, I would say as well. Or Serapis.
Somebody has made a good point. Duke Fort Gaming in the chat says there is a falcon-headed sphinx in the British Museum, and a quick check confirms it. So thank you. That's quite correct.
Yeah.
Falcon-headed sphinxes do exist.
Yes, I spotted that too. I'm not just thinking. So someone's saying that I walked around the bottom of the statue to look for an inscription, and someone says there's one there. I didn't see it, but that was what I was looking for. That was why I went around the bottom of the statue like that, because I was looking to see if there was an inscription there.
An inscription in hieroglyphs or in Greek?
Well, any. The person says Greek.
We see the lotus and the papyri.
Okay, so there is something there. Oh no, that's just all I can see is geometric patterns. I don't think there's any language there.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, I'm not. Again, this is outside my comfort zone, but I mean, Egyptian statues of gods don't always, as a rule, name the god. In 2 dimensions, you'd expect it more often. You'd expect a label text. Greek statues, do they name the person in Greek? I don't know.
No, they are usually uninscribed. The Greek statues are usually uninscribed.
Yeah. Okay. So it's Anubis Beast is saying in the game.
But he's equally holding the cornucopia that was equally assigned something that Arsinoe became a signature for her, as well as the wealth from a Greek. But I think with the ram horns, it's more Serapis than Zeus. I would say.
Well, it's very possible that they wanted to have some sort of very a really Greek-looking statue, and they took a sort of colossal statue that they knew of that had, you know, that gave off the vibe that they wanted to give for that.
But I have to say he was far more popular outside of Egypt than he was inside of Egypt, and I think that was one of the reasons where they introduced ARCE-MO instead, because it wasn't, not that it failed, but he was more popular. Serapis was more popular in the Mediterranean than he was in Egypt. So it could that even outside of Egypt he would have been represented again with the rams of the horn, but it's Serapis as the mix of Zeus, and it was more or less the image of one can say that like it's the cult for Ptolemy the First. He was very much identified with the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, who had a cult for himself as well, a Greek cult as well as Egyptian, even before the Ptolemaic ruler cult that was introduced later.
Yeah, I was actually there is a question about that in the chat from Traveling Daniel a little bit earlier. He actually asked, how did the Egyptians view Serapis and also the Isis cult that was outside of Egypt?
I have to say, for Serapis, he wasn't, but I don't know if he wasn't very successful, or as much as there wasn't very much, it wasn't the intention, I think, to introduce him to Egypt as a new god in the pantheon, in the sense of he had a very specific purpose to fit in the Greeks into the Egyptian society, and to fit in, to make the Ptolemaic dynasty fit into the Mediterranean. So it wasn't really targeted to Egyptian audiences, if one can say so. So I don't think I can say he was unsuccessful in Egypt. I would say that he wasn't really intended for Egyptian audiences. We don't have much temples for him apart from like very specific places in Saqqara, Memphis, or Alexandria. He didn't have a cult all over Egypt, one would say. But for Isis, I think that even started far before the Ptolemaic period, far earlier than the Ptolemaic period, that the cult of Isis, that has to do with the many tourists who used to come and visit Egypt and the appeal that she had. And I think the success of the Isis cult outside was the motivation behind developing the cult of ARCE-MO as a mixture of Isis and the queen, the sister queen, ARCE-MO II, and it was called Philadelphus, like the Philadelphus cult of both of them, the sister-loving, brother-loving god and goddesses. And this was very successful even within Egypt. It had her own temples, it had her own priesthood, and it was extremely successful, and it stayed up till the Roman period, while Serapis didn't survive much in Egypt beyond the early Ptolemaic time.
So where are we now, Gemma?
We're at the Serapeum.
Yeah.
I thought I'd just come here and have a little look in here. It's very incensey in this room.
This must be Serapis here.
This is Serapis here with the crown.
Strangely, a sort of mummy from a horror film kind of pose.
Yes.
Yes, but it is labelled.
But it's very interesting because this type of sculpture didn't exist in Greek, like the free hands. This type of it's a new technology. This technology didn't very much exist, and yes, you can see his name. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, doesn't it say Serapeon, not Serapis?
No, not Serapis, Serapeon.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem right. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, I think maybe they're just labelling the building, not just the statue. But anyway, there we are. That's Serapis.
But it's interesting. The worshippers looked Egyptian or Greek to you, or how did they look? I don't know. There were people praying. That would be interesting to know. Oh, wearing the toga.
Άνερ Απόλλων Λύκιος φως στέλνει και τη νύχτα διαλύει.
What do you think, Heba?
Yeah, but that's the thing for these games, because for me they could be well Egyptians, the way I see it, because I don't But interestingly, in such games or even in the media, it would be two things as an identification during the Ptolemaic period or in Alexandria. The darker of skin would be the Egyptians, and the poorer. I don't know if it's a sign of how that this is colonialism, exploitation, whatever, but I just want to reassure everyone that the majority of the Egyptians were poor even during the pharaonic period. So exploitation, because this is part of the problems with with how Egyptologists see the Ptolemaic period. They tend to see it from an exploitation point of view, and we forget that it's because of the extensive documentation that happened during the Ptolemaic period in the papyri and its preservation and in the administration, that we got to know about the exploitation of the kings to the population. And I assume that it was exactly the same case during the earlier total Egyptian pharaohs, but luckily for them, we don't have as enough documentation to see how it's there. But when it comes to exploitation, everyone was exploited, and for the ancient Greek, that was the same case. So yeah, I think that is always the problem that I have with the media. Yeah.
From what I can see, what we're looking at with these people who are praying, all of them seem to be Greek.
Yeah, but that's the thing. They could be very well Egyptian to me because they were intermarriages even before the time of the Ptolemies.
I mean, they are presenting them as what you would think of as, or what people think of as Greek. So you're right.
As Greek,
what would have been nice is if some of those people were actually speaking Egyptian as well. That would have been good. But
there were equally a lot of Egyptians speaking Greek at the time too. That's the thing. We need to.
I think we've lost Heba for a moment.
Hello?
Hello? Your Wi-Fi just dropped out a little bit.
Yes.
Then, sorry.
Yeah, I know. No, that's fine. Oh, I was saying we need to abandon this tick boxing exercise of the very clear-cut identification of what is Egyptian, what is Greek, what is Roman, because identities, even from the past until today, are far more flexible than the way we tend to put them when we want to interpret history. And I think it's just because it's easier to put people into typologies or to put them in boxes. It's safer and it's just easier than doing the hard work of deconstructing the many cultures and many societies that existed. But maybe it's good that we tell people that even if you see someone who looks very white and wearing something that you would assume is Greek, he could have been someone who's born and bred in Egypt, speaking Egyptians, and he could perceive himself as Egyptian because he was born, bred, and fed in Egypt, not as how we try to label him or her.
Yeah, 100% agree. Just going for a very, very quick run down the streets, and then I think I might just move over to Memphis so that we can have a look at a different city.
That sounds good.
Anubis Beast, there are some people around in Alexandria speaking what is the Egyptian language in the game as well. It's just that they were none of those people in the temple were. But there are definitely people around here who are, as Heba says, dressed to look more Egyptian and are speaking Egyptian to fit in that tick box. They just weren't up in that temple. Default Gaming has another question, which is: were there many Egyptians living during this time in, say, Athens? I realise that we may not know the answer to that, but I would say I suspect probably, there would be Egyptians living wherever there were, connections.
I think that's a really good question.
It's very interesting.
I don't know the answer to that either. And whether, I guess, first of all, none of us is an expert in the archaeology of Athens, as far as I know. I'm certainly not. But in any case, actually, the trick would be whether or not Egyptians are attested either archaeologically or otherwise. And that actually that's one of the difficulties, I think, isn't it, in trying to unravel this situation, which, as Heba has been explaining so well, is so complicated. And I think we might have said in the past once or twice in these sessions that it's often very difficult to identify, for example, Libyans or Cushites in Egypt, particularly if all we know about them is their, let's say, their names or their funerary equipment, because they might have adopted an Egyptian name and been buried with a load of Egyptian funerary stuff because that's what was available. So, I mean, like Gemma and Heba, it seems pretty likely to me that in an internationalized world, such as the Mediterranean world was by this point, it's pretty likely that some Egyptians made that journey. But whether you could identify them or not is really tricky. I suppose what we're saying about Egypt here is that there's a significant enough presence of Greeks, but also, as Heba said, actually, in earlier times, others as well, and also Greeks. It's not as though there was nobody in Egypt who was anything other than Egyptian up until Alexander the Great, and then suddenly there's a ton of Greeks, but nobody else. Actually, there were lots of people. There were Jews, there were Aramaeans, Carians, et cetera, et cetera. But we've got the evidence, archaeological and textual, that we've got, but that doesn't really allow us to see everything. But it's a great question.
That was a good question.
I feel like I could stare out of the window thinking about that for the rest of this session.
I was also going to say that we need to remember that the accounts that survived to us were the ones written by the most powerful anyway. So it's also, we know about the past, what they wanted us to know, that comes from those who held most power, because the others who held less power, who might have not been able to read or write, or might have not had enough wealth to keep extensive or expensive funerary objects that could have told us more about them. So it's equally a problem of who writes history in the end. That is an issue we still have till today.
Indeed, that's a problem everywhere, not just with Egyptian history, with all history. Who writes the history is something to think about. So I'm just going to. Sorry,
where have you taken us?
I'm in Memphis, but I'm on the very, very bottom edge of it by the water. So the city is up here, up to my left. But I just thought I'd enter it from down here, where it's kind of agricultural and nice by the water. Just because I wanted to really emphasize one of the things that I like about this game is that it, we've been sort of conditioned to think of Egypt as only being this desert place where there's just sand and ruins. We've talked about that many, many times. And that's a bad thing. And whilst there is that in this game, much of the actual action in the game, in terms of what you do as a character, so what our characters play the narratives through, is in the cities, is in the agricultural land where people are working and farming. And I think this is an important thing to note, that's because that's what most of it's like. It's a lived-in place. People are working. People are making food, going out doing whatever they're doing, and lots of Egypt is actually very green. So I just wanted to run through a little bit of this area before we go into the city. I can't guarantee the accuracy of the plants growing here, though, I have to say.
Apart from anything else, it makes you realise that we tend not to think of Egypt as having anything to do with the ocean. But, regardless of whenever it was built, Alexandria, the location is on the Mediterranean coast. We tend to think, I think, much more of kind of rural Nile Valley and Delta landscapes when we think about ancient Egypt, and this looks much more like that, with the Nile, obviously with the Nile and the desert and the mountains beyond. That's the classic Nile Valley landscape.
Sorry, I've just paused because there's some kind of ceremonial boat over here that I've never spotted before. and I wasn't really sure what it was, so I thought I'd just go and have a little look at it. It's got some kind of symbol on the sail. Interesting. Oh, it's got a Sobek statue on the boat. Sorry, that was a little a little detour.
Very interesting.
But yeah, that's quite interesting to look at. Perhaps not in the context of this particular session though. Okay, so I'll head up towards the temple then. To look at some of the structures that are not so close to the water edge and to the agricultural area. So we've obviously got these very large statues of Ptah everywhere over here. There is also this, which is it really does emphasize the kind of the network, the how important the river is, because it's, you know, it actually has little canals going through, showing people boating around, going to different places and things, which again, you know, I think a lot of the time when we think city, we don't necessarily think of people using waterways as a way to get to somewhere.
Yeah, I think you're right. And yet they are attested archaeologically and in other ways as well. One thinks of kind of tomb scenes, I guess, in particular. But the harbours and quays at Memphis haven't survived generally very well. I think there's a Roman quay still in existence. There are a couple at Karnak. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, this looks all kind of right and good to me, but we don't often visualize cities like this. You're quite right.
Yeah, I think it's just we're very you know, we're conditioned by the modern world, aren't we? Whereby we go everywhere basically by roads, and you know, even in places where there are rivers, and you could legitimately use that as a way of traveling. I think your mind automatically just thinks of roads and streets rather than waterways.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yet the Nile was the principal means of at least medium and long distance transport in Egypt.
Absolutely.
And it's the way that you know, ancient Egyptians conceived journeys of all kinds, including spiritual journeys as well.
Yes, definitely, yeah. Okay, I'm just going to stop here now so that you can kind of view the city a little bit. Oops, oh, I almost fell off. So you can see some of the houses, the little structures. These ones that are closer to the temple that are meant to be, I think, more wealthy kind of buildings. I think we have, in fact, lost Heba now.
No,
she's still here. Yeah, she's still
I'm
here.
here. Can you hear me? Yes, I had to stop the video so my internet doesn't break.
Oh, okay, no
because
problem.
it broke. Yeah, and I lost the connection for a bit, but I'm back now.
That's fine. We can make it so. There we are. Just make it so that your name's there.
Emma 2077 says, "Lovely city." Yeah, it does look very beautiful, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know. Wouldn't you just like to live here? It's very pretty. Very pretty. I've lost the video of both people. Not sure what's going on there. There we go. Okay, sorry, just sorting out the little camera weirdness there. But yeah, we've got Heba's name and we can hear her, so that's all that's important.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Have we got any other questions in the chat? So, guys, we've got about 20 minutes. So, if you do have questions, do please put them in the chat, and we'll try and go through them and ask them while we're in Memphis. Just sort of talking about this, and we will see what we can get through.
I want to ask Heba if she thinks that this is a particularly Ptolemaic Memphis or not. Alexandria, as we were saying, didn't really exist in the same sense until the Ptolemaic, whereas Memphis had a very, very long history up until this point.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Are you sensing the Ptolemaic influence here? I mean, I think we're in the reign of Cleopatra at this time. So Ptolemaic, we've had 300 years of the Ptolemaic period by the time of the game. So yeah.
Should I maybe fly around it?
Yeah, or we could have a wander around, or.
Yes, yeah. It certainly looks the way we imagine Egypt.
Yeah.
The concept of Egypt, that it's but I think yes, it would have had some Greek presence in a way, more or less. We don't have any of anything coming from like Memphis in the sense of temple architecture or construction. We have a bit in Thebes that shows a bit of a Hellenistic influence to it, or Greek influence in the temple construction and the architectural features that are remaining. We don't have much from Memphis, but it could be well as a state of preservation rather than how things were entirely in the past. I would assume the columns would have been more diverse looking columns, some of the things that was introduced also during Ptolemaic Egypt, the columns capitals. What else?
Yeah, as I'm flying around, I'm just looking for any of that type of architecture that I could run over to and have a look at. I haven't spotted any just yet, but I will.
But it could have been that it totally melted and became absolutely Egyptian. Why not? Because it was an Egyptian settlement, and there must have been a Greek presence there, but it became Egyptianized, like the other way around.
Yeah.
But I do love the landscape. Yeah, but here we have the Apis.
Some of the reliefs look to me like they're Ptolemaic in style.
Where?
In the distance there, behind the obelisks, lots of registers of gods.
Ah, yeah, that's true. I didn't see. Oh, yes. That's like the gates even that were introduced even in the Karnak by the Ptolemies. Yes, during the Ptolemaic period. Yes.
Yeah, so what they, I think, have done is they took examples of what they knew was Ptolemaic style relief, wall relief, and then used that everywhere. So obviously what we know is that there are layers of older things on temple walls, some of Ptolemaic era stuff after it on other walls. Maybe some things get replaced. It wouldn't have all been like that because it's the Ptolemaic time, but I think that it's less that it's not that they didn't do enough research to be able to make it that way. It's that the game has limitations because of needing to make it playable for people, basically. I actually just want to touch on something that someone said in the chat. So Ian Q Blank has commented when we were talking about Athens that he thought that he'd seen somewhere online they'd said that in Odyssey they were not allowed to use the real Parthenon frieze images because the British Museum has the copyright to them. But I actually don't think that that's true because I think as he said, it might be a Reddit conspiracy theory. They definitely don't have the copyright to all of them. There wouldn't really be any reason for them to decline to use it in that way because they're quite happy to share, usually anyway, to share images. it's much more likely to be that the game makers wouldn't have been able to faithfully recreate all of the frieze all the way around, because each individual texture then on this wall would have to be different. And if you look at here, you can see that this is repeated. So the temples that we've got here, yes, they have used actual Egyptian Ptolemaic inspiration to create this, but it's repeated because it's impossible to accurately copy into the game, because otherwise people just wouldn't be able to play it. You know, not everybody's got a supercomputer that can play something like that. So I think it's more likely to be that. I'm not going to 100% say that they did refuse, or rather, yeah, that they refused to let them have the images, because I don't know for sure, but I just suspect it's probably more to do with the technical side of things. Sorry, that was a little side.
I don't know the answer to this either, but of course they're not using photographs. They would have digitally drawn these things, and most of the time, if you're drawing something, the copyright is in the drawing, not in the original thing. So if I go to the British Museum and doing a drawing of the Parthenon marbles, I can do whatever I want with that. It's my drawing.
Yeah.
Emma, just back to one of the questions. Emma asked, was Memphis one of the capitals? And Anubis Beast has answered this in part. Yes, Emma, Memphis was the capital for most of dynastic Egyptian history, but kind of on and off. So as Anubis Beast said, it is one of the earliest capitals. The capital at the time of the reunification under Narmer was at Thinis, which is probably in the region of Abydos. We've never located it. But it's Memphis, certainly by the beginning of the Third Dynasty. And then it is the capital city for probably most of Egyptian history after that point down to Alexandria. It does move, particularly at times when Egypt is split into different territories. But when it's unified, most of the time, Memphis is the capital. It's also, throughout, it's the cult center of the god Ptah, the creator god, and it never loses that status. So even when it wasn't the capital city of Egypt, it was always very large, would have had a large population, would have been a walled, defensible city, and very important in religious terms. So and that also holds for the Ptolemaic. So even if Alexandria was probably, it was the seat of the Ptolemies, it was probably the most important and the capital city of the country. Even then, it's still very large, lots of people. It's the focus of not only the worship of Ptah, but by this point Apis, and also the cult of Imhotep at Saqqara, Apis, Serapis, Imhotep, etc., and the Serapeum and associated places as a focus of pilgrimage at Saqqara, Saqqara is essentially an extension of Memphis, made this part of the world as important in Egypt as anywhere else. So this is, that's a very important place.
Thank you, Chris, for answering that question.
And by the way, so Anubis also says Hut Ptah, I think. So the Hut Ka Ptah, probably better. So a Hut Ka is a house of the Ka spirit, but it comes to be used for temples. So the Hut Ka Ptah is the temple of Ptah at the center of Memphis, and that comes to be one of the names for the city itself. So the city comes to be named after the temple, and although we can't be absolutely certain about this, it is believed that the way that we say Hut Ka Ptah in our uncomprehending Egyptology way, it's more likely that the pronunciation of that set of words in ancient times was Hikuptah, and from that we get the Greek Aiguptos, and from that we get the modern word Egypt. So actually, the name of that temple is the origin of the word Egypt. And I say all that like I'm preaching, and I would absolutely defer to Heba if there's a better explanation.
No, you were absolutely right. No, I was going to say what I've noticed in Memphis, going back to the game, is how that everyone there has a very dark skin color, again signifying that they were all this is far more Egyptian. And interestingly, the temple looks very, very busy with lots of people in and out, but in reality, that was not the case back in the day. Like, the temple was a very restrictive place, and not everyone had access to the temple. And actually, far more people have access to the temples today than many of the Egyptians back in the past. It was very, very restricted who gets in and out, and mostly for the priesthood. The Egyptians would only be in if they are doing some sort of economic, because the temple was equally an economic center of the city, or the perhaps this is where most of the economy of any nome would sit, was in the temple, in the way that in the lands that cultivated, bringing offering and food, etc. That's the interaction that the temple would have with the rest of the population outside its walls, in the sense of commercial exchange, etc., or in the people asking for certain prayers to be called in their name. So it would have been interesting to see some of, perhaps in the game has shown some of the ear stelae that would have been all around the temple wall for the gods to hear the prayers of the people from the outside, that as a sort of mediation and as a sort to signify how that it was inaccessible, it was out of bounds. And the sign, the Greek sign that we had, it says that it's out of bounds for Greek soldiers, but in reality it was equally out of bounds even for the Egyptians who were living in Memphis. And as Chris eloquently said, like, Memphis remained up till the very end of even during the Roman time. It has always been the administrative center for Egypt, in the sense this is where the local priests would manage and would work with the kings in Alexandria. And even when it comes to when they make the meeting to write out the royal decrees, the royal decree, the hieroglyphic version of it would be written in Memphis and then gets distributed all over Egypt. So it was a very, very important center, even if it weren't at times not the main capital.
I can't resist picking up on this discussion again. Sorry, folks, I'll be quick. So somebody has Emma and Anubis are talking about the word Memphis itself, which is a Greek word, is a Greek form of the earlier Coptic Mamph, and that version of the name of the city, we think, comes from the name of the pyramid of Pepi. I forget if it's Pepi the first or the second of the 6th dynasty. The name of that pyramid, which is at Saqqara, is Pepi Men Nefer, meaning Pepi is enduring and beautiful, something like that. And that, for some reason, the name of that pyramid, Pepi Men Nefer, came to be another of the names of the city. So the city came to be known as Men Nefer, subsequently Manth, and in a Greek version of that, Memphis. And that's the word that we as Egyptologists use today.
Absolutely, yeah.
I always feel like all of this stuff, we should be taught this in Egyptology classes at university, and nobody tells you that stuff. You just get fed these things. This is called Memphis. This is called Egypt. You know, and the origin of this stuff is, I think, is super interesting.
Yeah, agree very much. So the reason as you've probably realized by now, I've just moved to Thebes. So I've gone out of the Discovery Tour and came down to Thebes. Because somebody asked a question about Thebes, so I thought we should just, since we were already talking, I thought I'll just move over. So Traveling Daniel said, what was Thebes like during the Ptolemaic period, and how would they have viewed the Ptolemies? I think he means people who lived in Thebes, people who lived in the south.
Yeah, I have to say, when we say the people who lived in Thebes, it's the priests, because they were the ones dominating the whole. They were the ones dominating the whole of Egypt, and it's important that we see the rivalry between the south and the kings in Alexandria, in the sense of the local priests' power. There was already the rivalry. Well, there was the competition between the priests in the north and the priests in the south, who would get to be closer, let's say, to the Ptolemaic royal house, in the sense, and getting closer to the royal house means that you would get far more privilege as well. And I think that this is one of the ways that we should look at the revolutions that happened during the time of Ptolemy V, etc., when they revolted against Ptolemaic rule. It usually gets painted in the sense that this is against foreign rule, but in reality, that's also part of the power struggle, the local power struggle that exists, which has always existed between the north and the south, even at times when Egypt was unified. But it can be, they can garner more support to it when there is a foreign ruler, because it can be shaped as like that this is a revolution against foreign rule, if one can say so. But obviously, this was partly because Memphis had far more power, the priesthood had far more power in the Memphis ones throughout the whole of Egypt, and they were the closest to the Ptolemaic courthouse. And obviously this meant that although there were usually the decrees ensuring that there would have been enough economic privileges, enough property, enough land to the temples throughout Egypt, but obviously the closer you are to the court, the more privileges you would get. So we need to also remember that at times in ancient time or in ancient Egypt, maybe now we all know the names of the kings who existed, but for an average Egyptian, he might have not known who was the ruler at the time, the name of the ruler. Like let's be a bit realistic about that. You could have been living in Thebes, and whether the king is Greek or Egyptian or whatever, you might have not been able to know exactly the name of the king, etc. Unless when it came during the Ptolemaic times, when they introduced the royal oath, that became part of the link, that everyone would know what's the name of the king, because this is part of the legality of the court. But before, we shouldn't think of Egypt as the way we see it today, that that the average Egyptian wouldn't have had access to the wealth of information that we have access to today.
Yeah, Heba, I totally agree with that. I actually think that's a super important point, in that we have currently, in this today, we have got access to more information than anybody ever has had before. Like as regular people, we have got access to so much information that would have been just completely, unknown to the majority of the people in times past. It's a really, really important point.
Yes, not because they were uninterested, but it's just the division of power that was there, and that's part of how you retain the power. When you hold, the more you hold the knowledge, the more you have power, and that was part of the social order in Egypt.
I think that's a really super important point. I agree. Just to add though on Thebes, I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but there were a number of rebellions during the Ptolemaic period against the Ptolemies' rule, and these the rebellions quite often originated in Thebes. And there was, Heba made the point so well in her talk about how cleverly the Ptolemies attempted to manage a kind of multicultural society and multicultural population, but that doesn't mean to say that they were 100% successful all the time, and they faced resistance from within the country. And the priests, I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Heba, saw themselves as kind of the guardians of the traditional
Egyptian tradition. Yes, exactly. And they would be very cooperative with you if you're a foreign ruler, if you equally give them the power they need to retain their position. Because sometimes we tend to paint a very idealistic image of the Egyptian priests or of the Egyptian elite as if they were selfless. But obviously, like any human beings in the world, that they were equally selfish. They wanted to retain their power. But that comes also from the way we tend to see Egypt as the concept. We tend to always think of that. That's why I made the point about the exploitation. And that is one of the problems when looking at the Ptolemaic period, is that, or like that about the revolution, seeing this as entirely against foreign rule to perceive the Egyptian tradition I don't know if that can be accurate, because why only do it during the reign of Ptolemy V when it became a bit weaker, and Egypt was struggling economically. Not only the south, but the whole of Egypt was struggling economically. Obviously, there is the opportunity there to revolt, but I think it also has to do with the local power struggle that we tend to usually ignore, that the priests only had universal aims, that they weren't, they were working for the good of the people, they were only for the good of Egypt, and they were the retaining of knowledge. But this retainment of knowledge meant that they can equally retain power. And there was already the competition between them from ancient times, but it just, I think that the high level of documentation that was introduced in the Ptolemaic period, and when I say the Ptolemaic period, I'm not referring here to the contribution of the Greco-Egyptian kings or whatever. I think it's more to do with the whole society, with the priests. There was a huge rise in the use of documentation, meticulous documentation by the Egyptian priesthood as well, that we tend to know more about the culture, and that has to do with the administrative hacks that was introduced by the Greek court. It's just the fact that we know more about them, but that doesn't make it that doesn't mean that was not also the case during Pharaonic Egypt, when Egypt was ruled by Egyptians. It just could be like, because we know equally about Deir el-Medina and the revolutions that happened by those of Deir el-Medina against the injustice in payment, etc. But there is sometimes when we tend to look at it, or the way that, again, Egyptology tends to frame the revolutions occurring in Thebes against the Ptolemies as one against foreign rule. And I'm not sure that we can be 100% sure that this was the case.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps foreign rule is perhaps the wrong thing, but outside rule maybe.
Yeah, outside rule that is not based in the south.
The rule that is not them, basically.
Exactly.
I have to say though, this rendition of Karnak is actually quite beautiful though to look at and walk through.
I love it. Yeah.
As I've been walking through it while you've been talking and I've been listening, I've just been thinking, I love the colour. I love that there's colour on the columns and everything. It's nice. It's really good.
Me too. I wish it stayed.
Yeah. All right. Chris, have you spotted any other questions in the chat? We've maybe got time for one more, but if not, I think we might wrap up.
I don't. I think we have just about covered the things that have come up in the chat. Maybe we should give everybody like sort of 10 seconds to shout. Right.
Yeah.
If not, but I think we're coming to the end, aren't we?
We are. Everybody, if you've got one final question, please feel free to type it in the chat right now. I'm just going to ask Heba to give her overall opinion of the representation of Ptolemaic Egypt in this game. Yay or nay?
I don't know. Is there something in the middle? I'm not into black or white.
No, I know. I actually thought that's the kind of thing that you were going to say. Yes, there is definitely something in the middle. You say absolutely what you think.
Yes, I think yeah, they did well in part, and the only issue that I have is just the distinction between the very clear distinction between what is Egyptian and what is Greek, because I think that identities have and are far more flexible and far more diverse than these color distinction that are made of race. So yeah, I think that is the only problem I have.
Yeah, it's
that's
far
my
more
main
complicated
point.
Than
yes, it's far. Yeah, so my answer is it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. That is a good answer. Thank you.
Yes.
And I think Chris, it's fair to say that I think you probably agree with that too.
Yeah, I mean, my line all along has been with the game, and I'm not speaking either as an Egyptian, as Heba is, or as a specialist in Ptolemaic Egypt, as Heba is. But my sort of reaction overall, all along, has been that you can pick at some of the details and say, well, that's not right and that's not right. But with all the caveats that this needs to work as a video game, and you know, the game designers can't simply have big gaps on the screen where we don't have the evidence. it's really great as an immersive experience. It's really, really good. And I think they've picked, in some ways, a really tricky period because of these issues that we've been talking about of influence of, different kinds, different people in different parts of the country at this particular moment. They could have made it easier for themselves, maybe by going for a 18th dynasty period and only made it Thebes, or something like that. So I think overall, I still stick to what I've been saying all along, which is I think it's a really great immersive experience. You can really see where they've used the evidence really well, and if there are gaps, it's probably only going to be pedants and scholars like Heba that can see them really, really clearly. But it still works for me really well.
Heba's the scholar, I'm the pedant.
And I'm somewhere in between.
Absolutely.
I have to say, even me as an Egyptian, I usually get told by Egyptologists, how come I study the Ptolemaic period and I'm Egyptian? I should have studied a more Egyptian time period than that. And that says about the bias. So I'm not blaming the game. This is something that is existing. And as Chris said, I think they've done really, really, really well, apart from these few things here and there. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, Heba, when I first started studying Egyptology, I was somebody actually said to me when I said I might look at temples in the Roman period, just to write an essay. This was in my BA. Someone actually said to me, "Why don't you study proper Egyptian history?" Yes. I remember it. I remember that very clearly. I remember who it was. I won't say who it was, but I remember very, very clearly. And I thought, at the time, even, despite the fact that, as Chris says, we're never really taught to think about it in this way. We are very much given, this is the block of time that is Egyptian history, and this is then it's other stuff, and even then I remember thinking, but they're still Egyptian temples. I'm confused. I wrote the essay anyway. You'll be pleased to know.
Yeah, good. Well done.
All right, let's just very, very quickly. There's a couple more questions in the chat. I won't be able to do any more after the two that we've got here. I'm going to start with Emma's, which is, in the game, the Egyptians were sometimes treated as second-degree citizens by the Greeks. Was that historically accurate? And I think we can say that probably in some cases that might have happened. But it would more be the people who are in power are the people who are treating the people not in power as second-degree citizens. So the game structures, or the narrative of the game structures it that the Greeks and the Romans are in power at this particular, or they're fighting basically at this time period. So those are the people in power, and they are actually seeking to exploit the land of the Egyptian people. Whether those Egyptian people were, however you want to describe them, they might have been part Greek, part Egyptian, part other, from other places, because as Heba has said, there were so many people here at this time that they likely considered themselves to be Egyptian, regardless of where their heritage lay. So I think it's probably fair to say it could be historically accurate, but it's probably, again, more complicated than it is shown as in the narrative. Heba, do you want to say something? Because I have totally monopolized that question.
No, you've done really well, but I think that for whether it's a foreign ruler or a local, like they were second degree citizens all along. It's just that we tend to have more evidence from the Greek and Roman period than we have of earlier periods. So I personally think, for the way the world is structured today, they would have been exactly in the same position if it was the Egyptian pharaoh as well. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't see this as in terms of how we perceive colonialism today. Exploitation is not only between foreign and indigenous, but it can be equally auto-colonialism, like the locals within each other as a class issue. Mm-hmm. And class was a huge issue in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, I just also do want to say that if we're talking about it in terms of the narrative to the game, whilst I have just said that a lot of the time there's the Greek and Roman influences fighting each other for resources and things, actually there are also Egyptian enemies in the game, like people who are
Yes.
who are supposed to be or who are presented as being Egyptian and who are also enemies. So this it's not it includes people from all these different categories. In a way, I think, trying to say these people were all here. What it doesn't do is what you said, is realise that actually those categories didn't really exist in that structure. Yes, there were people from all those places, but often they might be the same people. So having a Greek enemy, a Roman enemy, an Egyptian enemy in those boxes to try and cover off on saying like, right, but we've got enemies from all places, we've got good people from all places. You are still categorizing them in those individual boxes, which I think is kind of the point really that you've really been trying to drive home today, is that doesn't really exist and probably never did. Okay, sorry, very last question then is going to be, I'll ask Heba and Chris for a single piece of advice if you want to become an Egyptologist.
I was going to say, don't.
I would say do it because you love doing it. Don't do it because you think you're going to make lots of money or have job security. Is that a good enough piece of advice?
I think that's a fair.
No, that's probably not what Anubis piece was asking.
No, it is a fair piece of advice though, and it is actually fairly important.
Yeah, it's true. I was going to say, I think in today's world, it's best that you study Egyptian archaeology and heritage somewhere that offers a world archaeology course, rather than go to a focused Egyptology department. I think that would would help you, and would help the study of ancient Egypt, having people that more like researchers that can see Egypt in a wider context, rather than the very, very, very narrow view imagined of Egypt that exclusively Egyptology departments sadly tend to produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not necessarily giving advice because I don't consider myself to be an Egyptologist actually, and
I was going to say I'm the same, more or less. I think they should read also the blog post written by Chris. Chris, you have a very interesting blog post on how you consider yourself as an Egyptologist or as an archaeologist, etc. They should definitely have a read at that. That can help him or her decide. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's important stuff to think about, like, because I definitely, from my perspective, I originally studied Egyptology wanting to become an Egyptologist and thinking about it very much from that narrow viewpoint, because that's what I had always known. That was what was in the books that you read and the way that things are presented to you when you visit museums, as you were talking about before, like the Ptolemaic Stela. I know exactly where they are in the British Museum. I used to work at the British Museum, so I'm very familiar with where everything is in the gallery. And yeah, it is. It's literally like at the end, at the side, kind of. You can just walk out the door and miss it in the Egyptian gallery. So it's not. It's really not giving. And considering it's actually quite a long period of time as well, it's just sort of, we're going to put this here because this is where it goes chronologically. So I think I approached it probably from that because that was what I thought it was. But the more I studied it, the more I realized that that's not what it's about. And, I originally started on Egyptology and classical civilization. And then they changed to single honours. They allowed us to do single honours Egyptology. So I swapped off that to do single honours Egyptology, which I would never do now. So I would say if you can, as Heba has said, if you can take something that's Egyptology and something else, then that would be really good, because it helps you situate Egypt's history in a much wider world history, which is really important, really, really important. So that's my bit. It's not necessarily advice, but that's what I think from my own experience. So right. Okay. Kate has kindly answered the question about our next broadcast, which is June 10th, and it will be Kate herself and Ziad Morsi, who they will be talking about Nile boats and travel on the Nile. Really excited, really looking forward to it. I hope that some of you will be able to join us then. We will obviously keep reminding you about it. And the last thing is really just to say thank you so much, Heba, for a really interesting presentation and a really, really good discussion. It's been really fun. I've enjoyed it. I hope that you have too.
Yes, I did. And thank you so much, you and Chris, for the kind invitation. I did enjoy it very much myself. And maybe I'll start playing Assassin's Creed as well. No promises though.